All right, everyone, we'll kick it off here. Good afternoon and welcome to GEI's Offshore Wind webinar. This is the first in a series we expect to do over the next couple months. My name is Elon Hasson. I'm the principal at Emerald Renewable Energy Developers, and I'm happy to host the Green Energy Institute's webinar on offshore. For those of you who aren't familiar, GEI is the Climate and Energy Policy Institute at Lewis and Clark Law School. GEI works to address the climate crisis by developing and supporting laws and policies that enable a quick and equitable transition to clean and renewable energy system. On the panel today, we have three great experts to talk about offshore wind. Please offer any questions into the Q&A, and we'll address them at the end of the program. So first, I'd like to introduce Elaine Albrich. She's a permitting attorney in Davis Wright Tremaine's Portland office, specializing in complex multi-jurisdictional permitting projects. She helps clients obtain local, state, and federal approvals for renewable energy projects and large-scale infrastructure development, along with alcohol manufacturing facilities. She's an experienced negotiator and encourages clients to be proactive on stakeholder engagement early on to avoid litigation and delays. Jamil Nasir is a member of the firm's energy group, where he provides counsel on a wide range of areas, including state and federal energy regulatory matters, administrative and court litigation, prudence proceedings, nuclear power, environmental issues, and insurance recovery, all on behalf of major utility companies. For the last 5 years, he's been heading up and focusing on offshore wind. He's been on the East Coast. He's going to have a lot of very interesting commentary on what's actually happened. And last but not least is Derek Green. Derek is an energy attorney in Davis Wright Tremaine's Portland office. He represents and counsels clients in the renewable energy space on regulatory transactions and compliance matters. Derek frequently writes and advises on the challenging legal landscape surrounding local energy and policy and climate change. And Derek is actually going to kick us off here. Derek, thanks so much for being on here. We've seen a lot happen in offshore on the West Coast in the last couple of weeks. Can you kind of get us up to speed and kick us off here and tell us what's happening?
Sure, happy to. And Elon, thanks thanks for inviting us to be on here today, and really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit here. So as you said, yeah, it's been offshore wind has seen a significant year, and it seems like it's only going to continue to go that direction in the years to come. What I'm going to do is talk for a few minutes about kind of how we got here and what this current status is from there. And obviously, there's a lot of factors, but it's kind of a confluence of both policy and technology coming together at this time. And so if we're going to start by looking at on the federal side of things. When the Biden administration came into office, they have significant climate goals, significant energy goals as well too, and that started off right away with an executive order that was signed early on in the Biden administration earlier this year, Executive Order 14008. Established significant goals for expanding offshore wind. A few months later, that turned into an announcement of a goal of 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. The point here that I want to emphasize is the interesting aspect of this is driven off of the executive order of the idea of having kind of an all government approach. A number of different agencies were coming together to try to meet this goal from there, being led by the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which is part of the Interior, and which we'll be talking about more as we go along today. Fast forward a few months later, in October 2021, the BOEM, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, announced plans for up to 7 new offshore lease sales by 2025. And for the West Coast, what was noticeable about that is that it includes both Oregon and California potential areas as well too. This next slide is from BOEM. It's the proposed leasing schedule and what the purpose of this is really to show a couple of things. One is things are moving fast. These goals are, it's hard to see, but we'll see another slide that zooms in a little bit more on this, but 2025 is not too far away. And there's a lot that needs to be done to get to the leasing part of it. What the bottom portion of this slide shows is kind of the different steps along the way that we need to get to before leasing occurs. This next slide shows a little bit more detail on that. And so when we talk about leasing, this is leasing in federal waters, and it's a process. There's a long process to get up to leasing. And it involves both state and federal coordination, coordination with a lot of stakeholders as well too, and it's a significant long process that needs to be played out. So I'm not going to go through all these different points here, but it's just these slides are kind of meant to reflect that this isn't something that just happens right away. It takes a while to get there. So the current status here on the West Coast. We've got in Oregon, again, this one from the federal side of things. BOEM has announced that they intend to release call areas in the federal waters in 2022. And that's in early 2022. From those call areas, will then should turn into wind energy areas, which are the designated, which are what turns into the leases. So going back to the prior slide, it's kind of a process of looking at calls or potential areas. Wind areas are then designated, and then leases come out of that from there. Lease sales are looking at 2023, so again, pretty quick. In California, there are 2 call areas out there, and those have been a little further along in the process than Oregon. BOEM is already undertaking some of the environmental studies that need to take place. The lease sales are anticipated to kind of happen in the next year. Washington, there are no call areas that have been designated yet, or that anticipated to be designated yet. What we want to show on this slide is just not to forget about Washington out there as well too. So there's been announced a proposal for a project off of Washington as well too, which is really interesting process. That there would be a collaboration between the Quinault Indian Nation tribe and some developers as well too. And this last note is just that to know that the regulators are looking at this as well too. They're looking at how the offshore wind process can play into the resource planning requirements that are out there for the different utilities as well too. So both turning to the states for a second here, state policy. Both California and Oregon both passed this year planning bills around offshore wind. Looking at California first, California just very recently passed AB 525, and this one, and you'll see a similar in for the Oregon legislation as well too. This noted the potential that offshore wind can have to meet both environmental benefits of the nation as well as energy needs of there. The high points of the California legislation is that it directs the California Energy Commission to establish a plan for offshore wind development in the next couple of years. It also requires California, the Energy Commission, to establish certain goals for how large of how many megawatts of offshore wind should be developed. It did not specify what those goals should be specifically from there. Oregon also passed their own planning bill, HB 3375. This one does note a state goal of planning for development of up to 3 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And I note that it's the stated goal to plan for. It's not the stated goal to have that amount at that point. So we'll see where that goes. But what this bill does, which is pretty narrow on its own, but it directs the Department of Energy to conduct a review of both the benefits and the challenges of integrating up to 3 gigawatts of floating offshore wind into Oregon's electric grid. And it also requires a report on that analysis to be reported to the legislature by next year. So that's kind of the state of the state for where things are right now. Elon, I'm happy to answer questions about this, but I know we want to jump into some of the other pieces as well too.
Great, thanks, Derek. Yeah, well, that was really good. You touched on a lot of things that are really interesting. I think Jamil will be able to, I'd like to ask him some of those questions. I think one of the most important things is the lease process. It's very cleanly laid out, but there's a lot of stuff that needs to happen both before and during it. I know the East Coast is ahead of us and has done a lot of this stuff. Jamil, I'd love to hear from you what things have worked well on the East Coast, what things haven't, and any lessons learned, and particularly if you can talk about the length of time that goes into these studies. I think that would be very interesting.
Well, on the East Coast, the good news is that offshore wind is going strong. Massachusetts, I represent National Grid, which is a utility that has operations in Massachusetts and some other states. But we've been working on the Massachusetts solicitations, and the first one was in 2016. And lo and behold, the prices were much better than we had anticipated. Better from the point of view of the customers and the utilities. They were lower, let's put it that way. Our second project, Mayflower Wind, was even lower than that. And I remember reading industry analysts saying that these prices were shocking. Well, they shocked somebody because this kind of set off a gold rush on the East Coast, where in the Northeast, which is what I'm most familiar with, where New York and New Jersey and Rhode Island and Connecticut have done their own solicitations, and I think largely based on the success of the Massachusetts solicitations. In addition to the prices, the offshore wind is predicted to have benefits having to do with fuel diversification and reducing winter price spikes, because you don't have to rely so much on gas, which is limited in the Northeast in winter, and just lowering regional LMPs because you've got more supply. So like I say, there's been this gold rush, and the licensing and permitting seems to be going smoothly now that we've transitioned to the new administration, which is more enthusiastic about offshore wind, and public support seems to be holding up. So far so good in those areas. Now, do you want to hear about the less good news?
There's less good news. Yeah, please.
Thanks. Well, the thing is, these Northeast projects are the first large-scale offshore wind projects that will be built in the United States. And I say will be advisedly, because the very first one of these projects, which is Vineyard Wind, only started construction a few weeks ago. As Elon mentioned, it's a very long process to, it's in 2014 is when DOE put some exploratory research buoys off the coast of Massachusetts and New York, and to see where the wind is blowing and so forth. And they didn't get around to leasing lease areas until a couple of years later in 2016, and then they had another auction in 2018, and then and these lease areas were pretty much snapped up. They're all pretty much occupied now, and since then, and since we awarded our contract to Vineyard Wind, it's been going through a long process since 2017 of licensing, and BOEM is the first hurdle, but of course then there are state issues, state regulations, and here in the US of A we have municipalities, we've got counties, we've got states. These all have jurisdiction over something, and so there are dozens and dozens of permits and licenses and permissions and approvals that you have to get, any one of which can can destroy your project. And so there's risk in this business. It's like I say, it's the first time we're doing this in the US. Furthermore, the biggest turbines that have ever been built worldwide are about 9.5 megawatts. The developers in the Northeast are talking about turbines that are 12 megawatts, 15 megawatts. These things are giant. They're the size of the Eiffel Tower, literally. They're very, very big. The water is deeper than most of the water that they build these things in Europe. They're farther from shore, like 20, 30, 40, 50 miles from shore. And so what do you do in a situation like that where you've got all this risk? Well, there's a lot of pushing and shoving that goes on in the contracting between the utility companies and the developers, because that's where you allocate the risk. That's where you say, here's what here's what triggers a default. Here's what your remedies are for a default, and all kinds of things. There's just, a lot of attention paid to these contracts. Now, the whole purpose behind this approach, which is having the utilities sign often 20-year contracts with the developers, is to quote unquote de-risk the projects for the developers, because this whole area is so new that it's felt that developers won't want to take on these risks unless they are sure that there's a revenue stream in the future for them. In New York, they've done it a slightly different way. It's the state itself which contracts for 20 years with the offshore wind developers, so there's a lot of risk. There's also potential for risk. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I jump in real quick? So the state of New York itself is contracting with the developers. How do they then interface? How do the power then get to the denizens of New York?
Well, the way that it works in New York is that the energy and the environmental credits are separated. What the state buys from the offshore wind projects is something called ORECs, offshore wind energy credits, renewable energy credits. And they tell the developers, you can sell your energy wherever you want. Okay, we're paying you to generate energy using wind power, right? And we're buying these energy credits. Now, then they turn around and sell the energy credits. There's a requirement that the utility companies in New York buy the energy credits from the state. So that's how they're funded. But they don't care so much about where the energy goes. That's an additional income stream potentially for the developers, right? And that makes the cost of the environmental credits cheaper, because they can afford to give you a cheaper price because they're selling their energy. So that's the way they do it in New York. In the other states, it's the utility companies who sign the 20-year contracts with the developers, and then they get paid for that in their rates from ratepayers. It's a different approach. I mean, more issues. The transmission and interconnection processes that are in place currently are not very well suited to offshore wind, and in some cases other renewables, because the way it works now is that if you want an interconnection with the transmission system, you go to your transmission operator and you say, I'm building a plant that has 500 megawatts and I want capacity service from you, capacity transmission service. And the ISO says, okay. They model it, They tell you how much you're going to have to pay to upgrade the transmission system in order to make that work, and then everyone, it proceeds from there. You get to interconnect. For offshore wind, nobody's really sure yet how much offshore wind will be built out in the water, and it would be nice if the planning process for transmission could go along in parallel with the planning process for the generation or the procurement of the generation. Currently, that doesn't happen. There are a couple of examples in the country where that might be used as as examples of how this could be done. Texas has something called the Competitive Renewable Energy Zones, and California has the Tehachapi, I believe it's called, Tehachapi Renewable Transmission Project, which takes a build it and they will come approach to transmission, which is we'll build a bunch of transmission in places where we think that there's a good potential for renewables like wind. And then as these renewables come along, we'll charge them to use these lines, and that's how you'll pay for it. But currently there's a shortage of interconnection on the East Coast. There's a shortage of transmission because traditionally energy flows from inland to the coast rather than the other way around. So a lot of adjustments are having to be made.
Can you talk a little bit about what Ferc is considering, and can you also go through what Ferc is and what an RTO and an ISO is and how those kind of fit together?
Sure. Ferc is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and it sort of has jurisdiction over everything that the Federal Power Act gives federal jurisdiction to. In other words, there's a split in jurisdiction for energy law, and Ferc has some of it, the states have some of it, localities have some of it. Ferc is the commission that takes care of the federal part of that. RTOs and ISOs are just transmission system operators, and it's their job to run the transmission system, make sure everybody has fair access, and they also often run the markets, like the energy markets, the capacity markets, and so forth and so on. So what Ferc has been doing is, well, to date, they've not taken a leadership role. Their view to date has been, you guys in the states or in the RTOs come up with some good ideas of how to integrate wind, offshore wind, and other renewables into the competitive markets. Bring us proposals, and we'll look at those proposals, and we will, decide whether or not they're acceptable. Just this summer, they have issued an ANOPR, which is sort of an announcement of a rulemaking. It's a NOPR is an announcement of rulemaking, and ANOPR is an announcement of a rulemaking.
It's an announcement of a proposed rulemaking, ANOPR.
It's something like that.
Everyone can see the importance of acronyms, I hope. On this
I'm sure that it's very scientific at some level. Anyway, they are looking for ideas and ways of better integrating renewables, including offshore wind, into the transmission and interconnection processes, which is a much needed thing because currently there's a lot of problems. There have been controversies stirred up by the fact that you've got these renewable energy projects that are in part subsidized by the states that are bidding into the capacity markets, and some of the folks are saying, well, that's not fair because they're getting money on the side so they can bid lower prices. So the RTOs and ISOs are saying, well, we have to mitigate their prices, and then the states are saying, we have these policies, you guys are frustrating our policies. So there's lots and lots of messy details that have to be worked out, and Ferc is just at the very beginning, I believe, stages of trying to work that out. But it'll be years before, there's anything implemented.
And this is a very public process that people can track the discussions on.
Yep.
If you look at the federalregister.gov under the ANOPR and offshore, you should be able to track this and see what will be coming about in it.
I would also put in a plug for a blog that was written, and I believe it's dated July 22nd by Sean Atkins and some other folks at DWT, talking about the ANOPR and describing it and giving some details about it. So if folks are interested, they can go to the DWT website and look that up. How's that for a plug for my law firm? More issues. Offshore congestion. We had hoped in Massachusetts that we could build a transmission system offshore so that everybody wouldn't have to build their own wires. As it is now, each offshore wind project is building its own generator lead line from its offshore project to shore, right? We wanted to minimize the impacts by building an offshore transmission line that everybody could connect to, because we thought that would be more efficient. It would be cheaper in the long run. It would be less disruptive to the environment. Given that Ferc and the feds have not established like a carbon price, given that there's been, like I say, this sort of lack of progress on integrating renewables, it wasn't clear how to do that, to build a transmission system. So we ended up asking the bidders in the first round of the RFP to propose what we called an expandable transmission system, which is like transmission that you could then build upon later on as more folks enter the market. Well, that didn't work. Our next thought was to have the developers, when they bid, agree that they will negotiate in good faith with future users that might want to piggyback on their infrastructure. That's called the commitment agreement approach. That's what we use now. The fact is, though, that you're going to end up, I believe what's going to happen on the East Coast is you're going to end up with this spaghetti of generator lead lines, competing, tearing up the bottom of the ocean, potentially squeezing each other out, and it's unnecessary. So, one of the things that the West Coast might want to think about is get ahead of this process. Try, if you're going to do generation or transmission planning, do it now. Don't wait for FERC. Don't wait for, do it, get ahead of it somehow. Maybe the state could do it. Maybe the utilities can do it. Don't wait for, don't wait around for FERC or someone else.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. I think you said something that's really interesting that also relates here on the West Coast, is that they're really far out, and then you're going to build these transmission lines that come onshore, and the state waters, I think, are at 3 miles on this side. And so I think that's kind of a good lead-in for Elaine. Elaine is a permitting expert who I've worked with for a while and has an excellent grasp of the myriad of agencies. Elaine, I mean, there's lots of things when you consider when offshore comes onshore, but certainly the transmission lines, one of them. Can you talk about the myriad of different considerations there in terms of agencies and everything else?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Nice to be here today, and feel free to drop your questions into the Q&A so we can kind of engage with you as we go. I'm going to first just take a quick step back and give a recap of what's currently happening in Oregon related to offshore wind planning, and then I will jump to Elon's question and talk about the state permitting and how we might address transmission as well as the floating offshore. So first off, just a quick recap. There's a lot going on in Oregon right now with offshore wind planning. There's the BOEM process that's ongoing, and DLCD as the lead state agency involved in that. There's a data gathering and engagement planning process. There's been 9 stakeholder engagement task force meetings, and the data collection is ongoing. There's a House Bill 3375 study where ODO is looking at offshore wind planning and identifying primary opportunities and hurdles. There's not offshore wind related, but related to part 4 of the Territorial Sea Plan for undersea cables, which relates to the transmission issues Elon touched on that we'll be talking about later, is a study for DLCD to undertake a review of part 4 of the Territorial Sea Plan to see whether amendments are needed to address potential conflicts around submarine cables. These are the fiber optic cables that are coming in from offshore from international waters and landing on the coast. There's an ongoing Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Assessment, or ERISA, that's been DoD funded but led by the Oregon Department of Energy with DLCD effort also. One thing I flagged for this is that it's still in draft form. We're waiting for the publication of it, but in earlier versions, there were some red flags from the military about certain swaths of offshore for siting. And then finally, we've got the Oregon Renewable Energy Siting Mapping Tool project that's going on. Mapping has its pros and cons. The one good thing though about this is that it makes a lot of data available to everybody along with associated GIS layers. So if we want to skip to the next slide. This is just a quick slide to kind of give you a framework for where we are at. As we've talked about throughout the presentation, this is a very long process for planning and permitting offshore wind. We are very, very early in the Oregon process. As I mentioned, BOEM's been engaging in its stakeholder outreach in coordination with DLCD. It is anticipated that we should have some preliminary feedback on potential draft call areas by the end of the year, with BOEM anticipating releasing draft call areas in Q1 2022, maybe as early as January. There's some concern, there's discussion about that date may slip a bit. There has been some discussion that BOEM needs to undertake further analysis before releasing those potential draft call areas. So stay tuned on how that plays out with the BOEM process. Next slide. Since this is a CLE, I thought I'd include a slide here that shows you the different jurisdictional elements that are at play. This is focused mainly on the state jurisdictions within the territorial sea. We are talking about the territorial sea, state waters, and then federal waters. And so these are just for your reference of some of the laws that come into play when we're dealing with siting projects in the territorial sea. Just quick list of the players, and by no means is this the entire list. I want to make sure that that's clear for the audience. This is more to be a focus on the regulatory players, I'm going to talk about sort of the permitting process and who has their regulatory hats on. There are numerous stakeholders and players, what I would call players in this planning process and engagement that's happening right now. So by no means is this meaning to be a comprehensive list. BOEM's not on the list. I didn't include ODF and W. So mainly this was just to hit on some of the high points of, you've got the Army Corps of Engineers who addresses the removal fill in waters of the US. You've got NMFS, or National Marine Fisheries Service, because I'm not supposed to be using acronyms, who deals with ESA consultation. Then you've got the Oregon Land Conservation and Development Commission, which is kind of the main land use planning agency within the state. ODF or DLCD wears quite a few hats in their regulatory role. They're probably the closest thing that Oregon has to the Oregon Coastal Commission, or sorry, the California Coastal Commission, but different in how they implement the Coastal Zone Management Act. So just to highlight some of the kind of the roles of LCDC and DLCD, they've got the Ocean Policy Advisory Council, who's advisory in nature. Then there's the agency itself, responsible for implementing the Territorial Sea Plan, and it's DLCD that does the Coastal Zone Management Act certification for federal actions. Next slide, please. We've also got DSL, Oregon Department of State Lands, for removal fill permits within state waters. DSL also has a dual role in the fact that they're a property owner, and so they are in charge of authorizing easements for placement of infrastructure on state lands. You then have Oregon Park and Recreation Department. This agency is the steward of the beaches. And so they're responsible for issuing the ocean shore alteration permit for any activities that take place on or under the beach. And then you've got the drive on beach permit, more administrative type permit. You've got DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, involved with clean water, 401 certification. And then of course, you've got your local governments and the county governing bodies and planning commissions. So I provide that framework because I'm going to go next slide to Oregon permitting and siting, which I think right now is a bit of a mind-blowing exercise to get your head around of how this is all really going to work. You know, this is an incredibly multifaceted effort. It's going to involve so many different interests and stakeholders. And in addition to that, you're dealing with the natural environment and you know, other resource conflicts. So this is just a pretty mind-boggling exercise to think about how we're going to put this all together for Oregon in what I would think, you know, want to advocate for, the Oregon way. And so just thinking about that, we've got siting constraints, multi-jurisdictional permitting, you know, numerous diverse stakeholders. We've got the real reality of transmission, both offshore and onshore, and then the just staging and construction, and then of how that relates to both, you know, port infrastructure, vessels, workforce, on and on. Next slide, please. So I wanted to use this slide to really dig into sort of the permitting dynamics that we might be seeing for offshore floating wind. This is a slide that is based on a submarine cable landing project. And so I thought we could use it as an illustration for lessons learned from submarine cable landings as it relates to offshore wind, given that our transmission lines to onshore are essentially the same kind of undersea cable where we would land on the coast. So you'll have a similar permitting regime that applies to it. So here we've got the different layers of, you've got Army Corps, you've got DSL for the removal, you got Army Corps for removal fill for federal waters, you've got DSL removal fill for state waters, you then have DSL for their proprietary interest for their land ownership. So you have your state lease. And then you have your OPRD permit for your on beach or under beach work. And then you have your local permitting with the local county, presumably, for your infrastructure that's upland. And so in dealing with this, you are having to navigate multiple permitting processes at the same time to obtain ultimately your kind of bundle of approvals in order for you to move forward with your project. And I don't have a slide for this, but I did want to highlight that for offshore wind, we'll not only have this kind of regulatory overlay and jurisdiction and permitting interaction happening, we'll then have the overlay of the BOEM leasing siting process, which I think goes back to Derek's slide 4 a little earlier, where you see like how a project has to move through BOEM's process. And at the same time, it'll be moving through the state and other federal processes and local process. So you've got almost, you know, 3 or 4 tiers, depending on how you look at it, at permitting happening at the same time. And right now, there's no real consolidated permitting process. So it's going to be on the developer to really put together these types of permitting strategies that minimize risk and have everything kind of moving along at the same pace in order to end up at the finish line at the right time with all the different processes in play. And I think, one of the things I want to talk about, and I'm curious if anybody has any input from the audience on how we could be better at this in Oregon, is having early stakeholder engagement and in really trying to create, next slide, please, I'll talk from that one. In trying to engage in deep stakeholder engagement and looking forward and to think about cooperative agreements and proactive mitigation strategies that we can start developing that are not project specific, but more tied to the larger kind of like planning effort. And so in looking at that, one example is the Oregon Fishermen's Cable Committee. That is a committee comprised of fishermen and cable companies who have come together, and they have a joint agreement for how they navigate coexistence. And those agreements are funded in part by the cable companies into a fund that then is used to, this is really simple the way I'm describing it, but used to reimburse the any damage that the trawl fishers results in from getting their nets and stuff caught on any cables, but in turn it also releases them of liability for any damage to the cable. So it's a real reciprocal kind of mutual benefit agreement. And it addresses things too about how the fishermen want the cables to be buried, how they expect patrol vessels to be involved when cables are being laid. It involves sharing information about as-builts and 24-hour reporting. And so I just think that there are some examples out there that Oregon can be looking to from other industries and thinking about how we really put together kind of our model for Oregon offshore wind permitting ahead of time. And California, we're not really talking about California today, but California is a bit ahead of Oregon with their call areas and where they're at with their BOEM leasing. But I still think there's some really distinct differences between Oregon and California and how Oregon may look at doing their planning. So those are some of my thoughts about where we might be headed with offshore wind planning for Oregon. Long way of answering your question, Elon.
Thanks. So when those, maybe can you go back up a couple slides, Derek, to the, I think to the jurisdictions. So when you've got an underground cable coming in, Elaine, maybe two more. So the wind farm's going to be out, past the state line. And maybe Jamil can jump in here. Do those typically go underground, or are they floating onto shore? And then would that be its own? I guess the question, Jamil, has that been its own process, or the utilities do that, or a developer does that? So a couple questions. One, Elaine, maybe you can start off with like, when they come on shore, who do you have to talk to? Yeah. And then two, is there a typical way to do it above or, above ground or below? And then three, who owns that mess? Yeah, good questions. And kind of, I'll start, and then Jamil, I think, can jump in. So we were looking at here between the state, the 3 nautical miles, and the federal line, the 200 nautical miles. So that's the BOEM area. And what we would be seeing, or what we've seen with submarine cables, is that they lay on the bottom of the ocean floor and then are only buried in certain areas to minimize disturbance to the floor. I guess a question that you're raising is whose lines are those? So with respect to wind permitting, those transmission lines could either be viewed as like a GenTie line, that's the project's line to interconnect them with the grid, or depending on maybe if there's multiple users of a single line. I don't know, Jamil, what do you think? I mean, would it ever be a utility line out there that it's actually part of the grid?
It could be. In other words, if they were to build a transmission system out there for the wind folks to interconnect to, that would probably be built either by one of the local transmission companies or by another, transmission company that would come in and bid for the work. And then, sort of following up on Elon's question, the way that it usually works when following up what Elaine was saying. So the cables come in, and then once you get to the shore, they bury them. And then, they may go a few hundred yards or even a couple miles underground, and then they come out. All that is owned, at least in the East, failing the transmission system. These are generator lead lines. They're owned by the project, by the developer of the offshore wind project. They go underground and they come out next to a substation that's owned by the whatever utility owns the transmission in that area, and that's where they interconnect. So there's a change in ownership. There's an interconnection point between the generator lead line owned by the developer and the transmission system owned by the local transmission provider.
Got it.
And I mean, the county and the municipality are also involved. I noticed that Elaine's got a county listed on her slide there. That's no joke. Those folks are very serious and just as serious as the federal or state permits are the local and municipal permits.
Cool. Hey, Elaine, one question I had in your in the alphabet soup of Oregon stuff, we don't see FSEC doesn't seem to be very prominent here. What's typically, so first of all, FSEC is the Energy Facility, I can never get Oregon and Washington straight, Energy Facility Setting Council. I might be dropping a letter in there. And they're typically citing large energy projects. I think they're related to DOE. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that relationship. And you can talk about either what role they've had or what role they might be able to play here in offshore.
Well, that's a provocative question, Elon.
I'm a provocateur.
So Elon's referencing the Oregon Energy Facility Siting Council, which the Oregon Department of Energy is the agency supporting the council, or ODO. The Oregon Energy Facility Siting Council serves as a state level siting authority for large energy facilities. It was formed by the state legislature, I can't even remember when, the 70s, I think, and was originally intended to help permit projects like nuclear and baseload gas plants. But over time, it's more focused on the renewables and all the renewable development across the state, whether it be wind, solar, combinations thereof, add battery storage, transmission lines. And so FSEC has jurisdiction over the larger projects where the counties still retain jurisdiction over some of the smaller projects. For offshore, it's a bit different because we're talking about federal waters for the floating turbines. And so it's a question of how the state agencies, including FSEC, may play in that BOEM process. But then you also have, the related and supporting facilities from the floating turbines themselves that will be in state waters and coming ashore. And so that's, kind of an open-ended question of how FSEC would view that. FSEC has jurisdiction over transmission lines, but only under certain circumstances. So it is definitely, I think, something that we'll kind of see how it plays out, Elon. It raises the other point, though, of which Oregon agency is really going to be the lead here. Or is there going to be some type of coordination process among the agencies for these types of reviews? We have yet to see how that will play out.
Cool. Thanks, Elaine. I know that's a tough question. Speaking of tough questions, Derek, so Oregon's got this study bill. We've talked about a myriad of issues, and Jamil has sort of has advised the state, like, hey, you may want to think about this ahead of time. Do you know, can you describe at all how the bill is taking information in, and what might be good ways to convey some of this stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So the study bill, that process is already ongoing. There's a pretty quick turnaround for Odo to put together the report. But essentially, what the bill calls for is for them to do a literature review. Odo has already done some outreach to request what that literature review should look like, what should be included with that piece from there. What I would recommend is anyone who is interested in this, it's on the Oregon Department of Energy's website. They have there's a specific webpage for the study bill, and it lists both the outreach that is going to occur, also because there's going to be at least a couple, I believe at least 2 public hearings or public meetings on this as well too. But the website is the best place to get information as to how to be a part of that process, and what needs to be if there's any suggestions for what else Odo should be looking at. And I would recommend that happens sooner rather than later, because my understanding is that Odo is looking to wrap up that part of the literature review in the near term future.
Great. Thanks, Derek. Hey, so folks in the audience, we do have Q&A open now. We've got about 20 minutes left on here, so feel free to populate it. I'm going to take advantage of having like 3 of the smartest attorneys I know and ask questions of them for my own personal benefit. So I'd encourage people to come in with other questions. But one thing that I think is fascinating, Jamil, I wanted to talk to you about is a quirky little law called the Jones Act, which you had up in your slide. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Jones Act, I think, was passed quite many years ago, and it's sort of a protectionist, quote unquote, act. Basically, it says that foreign shipping can't be used in certain kinds of U.S. commerce. So, for example, if you want to ship something from one U.S. port to another, you're not allowed under the Jones Act to use foreign vessels to do that. The reason that this affects offshore wind is because there are very few specialized vessels that can be used to install at least the fixed foundation turbines that we have in the East, and they're mostly foreign vessels. I think there's one that's being constructed in the United States, but question, how do you finesse the Jones Act so that you can use those foreign vessels, rent them, or have somebody sell you one or whatever?
Cool, thanks. I think that was one of the interesting things, is that so I mean, as a developer, when you think about operating these wind farms, the operation costs are significant. You got to service these things with ships, and the most experience comes from Europe, and we don't have that. We don't have that facility to just bring all those boats here. So that's
it's even worse than that, Elon. The ships to install the turbines have stilts, so they go out and then they rise up above the water on these stilts. So they're, a few meters above the surface of the water, because they need to be stable in order to, and then they have these huge, gigantic cranes that then pick up the foundations and lower them. So those ships are not a dime a dozen, and especially the ones that can be used to install the gigantic turbines that the US developers are talking about. So, it's the installation ships that are an immediate worry.
One thing just to pick off on that too, that we didn't really talk about too much, but in terms of the differences of East Coast, West Coast, but it's not a very basic difference. Is though West Coast, most of the studies are looking at floating offshore wind as opposed to the fixed bottom ones from there. So that it's a different technology that's been used in other countries. So it's not so it's been proven to some extent, but it raises different issues in terms of getting it constructed than what the East Coast has been addressing so far.
Interesting. Cool. Do you have a question on the Q&A? Regarding stakeholder engagement, has there been much outreach to unions and community organizations to negotiate project labor or community benefit agreements that could provide for training, apprenticeship, labor peace, and pre-hire clauses? I think I don't have firsthand knowledge of the discussions that have been happening, but I can, and maybe Elaine can talk a little bit more. I have looked at the participants, and it's a pretty broad list in terms of who has been participating and has had a voice in the initial outreach. But I don't know if Elaine, you can speak to more.
I don't have a lot of specifics, but I do know that's been a subject of conversation amongst the different interest groups and a part of the outreach, because it will be a major part of making these projects be successful. So I think that is happening, but I don't have details on who are engaged in the conversations.
Yeah,
on the East Coast, actually, it's interesting because there's been increasing pressure in the states to include in the bids that the developers provide in these solicitations, to include economic development, what's called economic development benefits, labor agreements, training programs, facilities for manufacturing, all that kind of thing. So it's increasingly been a requirement of the state that those things be included.
Yeah, and I'll just add too that I know in Oregon, at least, that was part of the impetus behind the planning bill, and the idea here is that a lot of the interest is coming from communities outside of the urban center in Portland, in places that are looking for different ways for economic development in coastal regions. They could see a large benefit from potentially could see a large benefit from these type of projects as well too.
Great. Well, let me turn it back over to the panel. Any closing thoughts or any ideas you have? I'll go. We can, yeah, feel free to add questions and I'll take them right at the end there. But we'll go Derek, Jamil, and then Elaine.
Sure. Yeah. Well, again, thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this today. You know, I think it's a very exciting time in just energy policy generally. I mean, there's so much change that as we try to shift more to renewables and carbon-free future out there, and offshore wind is there's a lot of policy interest in making it a large part of that future, and I see that there's a lot of potential there. But you know, I think one of the ideas that we had today too is to show some of those hurdles that need to be addressed to help us get there. But hopefully it's things that we can find a way to make it work.
I would just add to that by saying, ending on a positive note, which is that most of the problems and issues that I've described are sort of what you might call problems of success, because no one anticipated how fast and how much the Northeast states would pick up on offshore wind energy. I guess the good news is that, you know, to the extent that there are issues, they mostly have to do with the fact that everyone's very enthusiastic about offshore wind and everybody wants to get in on the act. And so I guess that's, you know, that's a hopeful sign for the future.
I will just echo Derek. It's a really exciting time. There's a lot going on. You know, it relates to both onshore renewable energy development and the policy and response to climate change, as well as this new area for offshore. I will say, you know, as it relates to kind of my focus for permitting, there are a lot of interests that need to be taken into account. There's a lot of, resource conflicts that we need to look at and try to find a pathway for coexistence of different technologies and different users. So I hope that through some of this planning work, those conversations will go deeper, and that we'll be able to come out of the planning effort with some more kind of focused possible pathways to make sure that we're dealing with those types of issues and conflicts up front, rather than on a project by project basis on the back end.
Awesome. Hey, we do have a couple of questions coming in. Davis Wright team, do you guys have another few minutes?
Yep.
I've got like
Sure.
a couple minutes and then I got to hop.
All right. So first, is there a widespread use of cooperative agreements on the East Coast? And are these agreements available for the public as guidance for the West Coast?
What kind of agreements?
Cooperative?
I'm not sure what that's referring to. Can you be more specific?
In terms of public guidance, I cannot. I'm going to wait for the questioner to clarify it if she
I mean,
can.
most of the documents that we receive and that we issue in the process are public. There are cooperation documents between developers and, say, the state economic development agency, if that's what's being referred to. I think that is
We got a clarification, like the Fisherman's Cable Agreement, where the fishermen have worked collectively.
Oh, interesting point. I mean, the fishermen have just started getting involved on the East Coast. They're maybe a little later than they should be. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but the fishermen have, the fisheries on the East Coast, on the Northeast, are organizing now, are commenting in the public processes, so we don't yet have a cooperative agreement with them, but presumably that'll happen. I mean, it has to happen because, as Elaine was saying, we got to share. I mean, the ocean is not just for offshore wind. There's boats, there's fish, there's airplanes, and we have to share it.
You're saying there's a lot of fish in the sea.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully there will still be.
This is a really good question, and I don't know. The question is when the lease sale happens in 2022, do you think the onshore transmission interconnection will be released around the same time? I'm curious if those will be a separate process or not, or if you will be sort of on your own to enter the interconnection process. So I'm not sure. So my assumption is that these would be separate, is that you would be, that interconnecting would be different from the leasing exercise. I will say that, Jamil, maybe you've got some other ideas here, or Derek. What's interesting is in the interconnection process across the country, increasingly RTOs, ISOs, and utilities are requiring some evidence of site control, which of course is impossible here. So I don't know if that's been discussed at all. It's a great question. Jamil, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, in the East, certainly the way that it's worked is because, again, there's no transmission system in the water. The licensing and the permitting and all that goes on with these generator lead lines is separate from the process that goes on with the RTO to interconnect, right? So you have to make it's all a separate process. You have to make your interconnection request. You have to make your request for transmission service. You have to do that and make those requests to the transmission operator. This other stuff with the lead line and going underwater and all that kind of thing, that's its own separate process that has its own separate, stakeholders.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there too and say my expectation on the West Coast, at least in Oregon, is somewhat similar. Is that I don't believe that is going to be connected. The transmission interconnection aspect is going to be connected to BOEM's release of the different lease areas, because this can be different stakeholders and players in terms of who, in terms of interconnection and then the transmission piece.
The executive summary is nothing is easy.
Well, I will put a little plug in. As I mentioned, we'll be doing another one of these webinars in January and next year. And on that, we will talk about transmission. Hamali Parmer, who's an expert in transmission from ICF, will be joining that panel. The other guests are TBD. It's loosely going to be described as the opportunities and what conflicts may arise, the opportunities and benefits and constraints in offshore. So that might be another good time to dig into that issue. But with that, I want to thank the panel, thank Green Energy Institute. And if anybody has questions, feel free to email me or anyone else, and we'll do our best to answer them. Up to Q&As popped up. Oh, okay, great. Awesome. Well, with that, I thank everybody.